Vincent van Gogh, the great Dutch artist, grew up in a Christian home. His parents told him about the love and truth of Jesus Christ. And Vincent van Gogh put his faith in Christ as a young man. He was deeply committed to Christ, but then he started experiencing depression. And the deeper he sank into depression, the more cynical he became. And eventually, Vincent van Gogh walked away from his faith. His depression became incredibly destructive as he maimed himself. But then slowly and gradually, you begin to watch him moving out of that depression back to faith in Christ. Vincent van Gogh used the color yellow in his paintings to picture the light of God, the grace of God, the love of God. And it's fascinating to watch his artwork. His pictures began to include more and more yellow, more and more light, more and more joy. And it's fascinating that that color yellow that he used in his paintings represented for him the presence of Christ, the presence of God. And then in his painting, The Rising of Lazarus, he actually puts his head, his face, on the body of Lazarus. Depression, fear, anxiety, worry can make us retreat from life, can make us retreat from God. And yet that's sad. Instead, God calls us to trust in Him and then to allow Him to help us work through our depression, our fear, our anxieties, our worries. Too many people in America today think that the purpose of faith in God is to have God solve all my problems so that there's no more pain, no more suffering. No, that's incorrect. When you and I experience pain, the challenge is to ask ourselves, God, what are you trying to teach me in the midst of this pain, in the midst of this suffering? The challenge for you and for me as human beings is to work through our pain so that we can know Christ better. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 10, the Apostle Paul writes, I want to know Christ and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in His sufferings. The fellowship of sharing in His sufferings. Do you understand? The all-powerful, eternal God humbled Himself, became a human being, and suffered. Jesus experienced pain. And Peter writes that Jesus used pain to teach him to always obey the Father. You and I can experience pain. And when we experience pain, the challenge is, are we going to allow pain to wake us up to the deeper issues of life, or are we going to allow pain to drive us into depression, into bitterness, into anger, into resentment against God, into disappointment with God? When you read the book of Job, you're confronted by a man who experienced a ton of pain. And yes, he asked God hard questions. He asked all the why questions. Why, God, have you allowed this to happen to me? Why did this happen to me and not to somebody else? Why at this time and in this place? And God never answered one of Job's questions. But in the last 4 chapters of the book of Job, God comes to Job and starts asking Job questions like, where were you when the moon and the sun and the earth were created? And God gives Job a bigger vision of reality. God helps Job see how small we human beings are, how big God is. And if we think that we're going to be able to wrap our minds around all the difficult questions and have good solid answers, we are naive. There's a tremendous mystery to life, but God has given us minds so that we can begin to understand reality. Also, God gave Job a deep sense of His presence, His witness. And that, friends, is the best way to deal with pain, to embrace the presence of God and to allow God to go with us through our pain. That is exactly what Mother Teresa did. She was a woman of deep faith, but she also struggled with depression. She also struggled with the hiddenness of God, with the silence of God. But she held on to Christ. She kept on doing what she knew was right to help the poor in Calcutta, India, and elsewhere. And as she continued to honor Christ with her life, she grew in faith. No, she did not always have overwhelming spiritual experiences. In fact, she struggled with real loneliness and real depression. But she held on to Christ, and she allowed pain to be a teacher instead of a discourager. She allowed pain to refine her faith. And that's exactly what Job did. For Job understood that his faith was not based on the circumstances of life. Instead, his faith was based on the character of God, which is good. Life is unfair, God is fair. Never get the two mixed up. Turn to a suffering God. Turn to Jesus Christ, for He can connect with you in your pain, in your anxiety, in your stress, in your depression, and He can pull you out and bring you joy and peace. God bless you as you put your faith in Jesus Christ.